In manufacturing, their demographics have aged so much already that China is no longer the low-cost producer for any manufactured product. There is not a product that the Chinese make that cannot be made in North America at a lower price point. Now, you have to build the industrial plant first. So I don't mean to suggest we can flip a switch and it's all here tomorrow.
Right.
But it does mean that anytime there's a hiccup in the Chinese system for any reason and somebody relocates, they never go back, because it's better with a shorter supply chain, with less energy, with less transport, with more efficient labor closer to home. There's not a sector where that doesn't work. And then in terms of industrial commodities, kind of an echo of what's going on with energy markets, they have to get it from a half a world away. They can't go at it and get it themselves. They are completely dependent upon the globalized system as enforced by the American Navy. So any of these issues by themselves are country killers, independent of the demographic situation.
Right.
And in the short term, I think we're seeing the whole system go belly up. I think it's safe to assume that most people have relatively formed opinions about whether the COVID vaccine is the way to go or natural immunity is the way to go. But I think if we're all really being honest with ourselves, we will admit that people on the other side of that divide have some relevant points that are worth discussing. And we certainly know that if you have both, you're in better shape. Neither of those are options in China. The Chinese vaccine doesn't work versus the Omicron variant, certainly not Omicron B. And because in many ways that the Chinese government was so successful at keeping COVID out these past 2 years, no one in China has natural immunity. So if they were to open up with Omicron B being the dominant strain, Omicron B is the most communicable virus we've ever faced, and it's the highest lethality rate of all of the COVID variants to date. If they just opened up, they'd have millions of deaths a month for at least 3 months. And in a one-man show government, that is how you bring the system down. So COVID lockdowns that affect entire cities, this is their only option for the foreseeable future. So Shanghai shut down on April 1. They reopened on June 1. They're in the process of locking down again already because Omicron is just so communicable. Masks don't stop it sufficiently. What is China if it's not a manufacturing center? Because that's all they have left. And now that is leaving very, very quickly. I think Apple's the best example there. Apple is the American company that has ignored the writing on the wall the most. And every time there's been a health issue with COVID or a trade war with Trump or Bernie Sanders coming out and beating the trade drum, every time something has happened, an explosion of genocide in Xinjiang, the crackdowns in Hong Kong, they've ignored it and they've doubled down. So they are the American company most committed to China. Over 90% of the supply chains within China now. And as of last month, even they started looking for alternatives. Everyone is on their way out because China is no longer a reliable manufacturing partner. First of all, China does not have many dealings in Africa. They have some infrastructure that they've built.
And they're they're doing a lot of loans there.
Well, whenever you see the Chinese spending $12 billion on something that's only worth $3 or $4 billion, that's not investment. That's capital flight. That's some bureaucrat taking advantage of that hyper financialized system to get some out. So when it's his time to run for the door, he already has a nest egg. I'm just saying that it's not in anything that would broadly be considered sound investment. Most of the infrastructure is not in places that are really of any use. I mean, if the Chinese build infrastructure in a place that hasn't had infrastructure for the last 70 years, you really got to ask yourself why there has not been infrastructure there for the last 70 years.
Someone would have done it by now.
Exactly. Now they are investing in some resource production zones, absolutely, but again, they're overpaying for them. So the Chinese are doing no refining and they're doing no manufacturing in Africa. So they're actually not taking the African labor force and bringing it up a notch at all. And if they want unskilled labor, they've got that closer to home in a place like, say, Cambodia. So for Africa to kind of move up the ladder, they've got to be part of someone else's supply chain. They don't have the indigenous capacity, technology, and capital necessary to do it all by themselves. And in a world that's moving into a tighter labor market, if you're not going to relocate the labor, you're talking about using some degree of automation to help out. Some places can do that, some places can't. but it's difficult for me to see kind of a neo-colonial manufacturing system set up to tap unskilled labor on a different continent, especially a continent that has as riven geographically as Africa. So the basic transport issues are
Yeah.
very, very difficult. It would be cheaper to do more automation in a closer economy. So in the case of Germany, that's probably going to be Poland. In the case of the United States, that's probably going to be Mexico and Colombia. In the case of China, that would probably be Southeast Asia. It is different and probably not in the way that most people are thinking. I'm not
Tell us.
overly concerned about automation being a giant job destroyer.
Hmm.
Remember, the Zoomers are the ones who are coming in, the smallest generation we've ever had, and they're not millennials, they're not social, they're antisocial, and
Hmm.
they're very loyal workers. They're very nervous people because they were raised by Gen X to be told that the future was a dark place where you will have no power, because that's what it has been for us to this point.
Yeah.
And because of that, they're very loyal workers. Once they get a job, they cling on to it like their life depends upon it. But they're antisocial. They want to work remotely, preferably in a closet, preferably coding. These are not line jobs.
Uh-huh.
These are not public service jobs. This is a very specific subset. So, if you're in San Diego in San Jose and you need a bunch of coders, great. Your workforce is covered for the next 20 years. You need them for anything else? Yikes. So we are going to need automation, not just because we have fewer workers, but because the workforce of those fewer workers is very, very different from what we have had for the last 40 years. So we have to have it. On the flip side, automation is one of the most expensive things you can do. It's expensive to develop, to operationalize, to install, and people always forget about this step, the most expensive of all, to keep it updated. That takes capital. We're
Yeah.
not going to have as much of that. So this wrestling over what little bits of capital are left is going to be huge. I would expect it to, yes.
Yeah.
The places that can do it successfully or most successfully are going to be those places that do have a stronger capital base like the United States.
Yeah.
I would also add in that in a world that deglobalizes, the idea of having a supply chain with 1,000 steps is kind of silly and honestly really dangerous.
Yeah.
So you need shorter supply chains closer to the end consumer.
I think COVID made us all realize that.
Absolutely. I agree, but
Yeah.
compared to what COVID has done, what's coming is a whole nother level in terms of
Well,
intensity.
tell us about that. Well, when you're finished, but
Sure. So manufacturing, especially for things like electronics, it does best, it's most efficient when it can tap different wage levels and skill levels. So you do the low skilled stuff in one place and the high skilled stuff in one place. And for the last 25 years, that has made China very successful. They do the assembly, they do the low end, and they do it at scale. So they can then have the intermediate and the higher end parts elsewhere in East Asia or maybe even in North America. And there's a lot of back and forth, and the average manufactured product crosses a border at least 100 times. Even in automotive in the United States, if you're taking each individual piece, you're talking like 25,000, maybe 30,000 border crossings. It's massive.
Oh my gosh.
In the world we're moving to, that's going to be harder to do. But the United States has Mexico. So we've got 130 million Mexicans, 35 million northern Mexicans very proximate to the border, and we can still play in that old style manufacturing. At the same time, we have the best capital structure to bits and pieces moving into the new style. And the consumer base is right here, both in the United States and Mexico. So having that everything proximate and co-located, that's going to be kind of the big mix of factors that generate outsized success. You're not going to have that in Asia, because the consumption base is gone and the labor structure is now too expensive. And if you break down maritime transport safety, those border crossings are more difficult because in the United States, it's a land border with a country we broadly trust. In East Asia, almost all of it is by sea, and the Chinese are making a point of being a bag of dicks at sea. So the very concept that you can have a maritime trading system in a country where China is either rising or falling is a bit of a reach.